All right, here's our third and final lecture on the Truman Doctrine, Truman Doctrine Part 3, and we're going to be focusing in on how the Truman Doctrine was applied to Asia. And if we go to slide 2, you'll see the words "the Cold War moves to Asia." The Cold War was certainly a global event that permeated the societies of all countries throughout the planet. The Cold War was going to affect those who live in Central and South America, throughout the Caribbean, those who live throughout Africa and the Middle East and Europe and Asia, Australia and New Zealand, Polynesia, everywhere. The Cold War was important. This was truly a global issue, this contest between communism and capitalism. Now, a good place to start when talking about the Cold War in Asia would be the most populous country on the face of the planet, the People's Republic of China. If you go to slide 3, you'll see a map of China. Just on a side note, you can actually look up into the northeast of China and you'll see a city named Chongchuan. Chongchuan, if you read it out phonetically, it would say Changchun, but it's Chongchuan. This is actually where I'm going to be living for the next 10 months. I won a Fulbright Scholar Award to teach history in China, and so I'm really looking forward to the opportunity. But enough about me. Let's get back to the Cold War and the Truman Doctrine. Well, during World War II, as you've done the reading in the textbook, Japan had proved to be totally expansionistic, moving into Korea, moving into China, moving into French Indonesia, moving into even the Philippines, and so forth and so on. And of course, these countries that were being invaded by Japan were not going to welcome the Japanese. There was going to be a resistance effort. There was a great deal of effort put forward to push the Japanese out. It was difficult. The Japanese were brutal, committed many atrocities during World War II, but nevertheless, the people of these varying countries, Korea and the future countries of Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and China are very much fighting tooth and nail to expel militaristic and expansionistic Japan. Now, one of the factions that is attempting to thwart Japanese efforts in China is led by Chiang Kai-shek. If you go to slide 4, you'll see a photograph of Chiang Kai-shek and another photograph of Chiang Kai-shek sitting next to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who's sitting next to Winston Churchill. Chiang Kai-shek is the head of the nationalist movement in China, and as you would expect, having been seated next to Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, sympathetic to the West, sympathetic to capitalism, and certainly Chiang Kai-shek is an ally of the United States and England here during World War II as the confrontation against Japan continues. However, Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalists were only one of two dominant factions attempting to expel the Japanese menace. The other faction here on slide 5 is led by Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong is going to generate a great deal of support amongst the peasantry. He becomes really a cult hero here during World War II. He has a broad following, and Mao Zedong develops quite a bit of notability for his bravery going up against the Japanese. But of course, Japan is going to lose the war, not because of the efforts of Chiang Kai-shek or Mao Zedong, but in large part because the effectiveness of the United States military and certainly the use of the 2 atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so all of the Japanese are forced to surrender. Japan is going to recede back to its island nation. Now the question becomes in China, much as we saw in Greece and Turkey, who is going to head the new government? Now that Japan is gone, what is the new government in China going to be like? And Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists are pro-Western and pro-capitalistic, and they are going to be going toe-to-toe against Mao Zedong, who happens to be a communist. And this boils over into civil war, and at the end of the day, Mao Zedong and his communist forces are able to rout Chiang Kai-shek and force Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists off of mainland China onto the island of Formosa or Taiwan. Now, Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists claim to be the legitimate rulers of China, but it's one thing to say that while you're hiding in refuge in Taiwan, and it's another thing to actually implement those ideals. Mao Zedong is able to establish himself as the ruler of China. China goes the way of communism. The most populated country on the face of the planet has fallen into the communist fold. And of course, this means that the Truman Doctrine in China proved to be a failure. And certainly Truman's Republican opponents are going to have a field day with this. The mantra is Truman lost China, Truman lost China. And certainly China still, at least tacitly, is a communist country, although it is quickly making its way into the global economy. It's now the second largest economy in an overwhelmingly capitalistic world. And Mao Zedong is kind of known as the George Washington of the People's Republic of China. So if you take a look at slide number 6, you'll see a photograph of me back in 2004 standing in front of the Forbidden City across the street from Tiananmen Square, and you'll see a big portrait of Mao hanging up on the Forbidden City, just an example of how he remains really an iconic figure in China. Although many of the policies embraced by the Chinese Communist Party today cut at sharp angles against the doctrines of Mao Zedong, he still is a very notable, important historical figure in that country and remains on their currency. So China goes the way of communism, and Truman, of course, has a bit of egg on his face. And so if we kind of do a tally sheet here of Truman's ability to implement his Truman Doctrine, we can say that he is successful in preventing communism from spreading in Greece and Turkey by virtue of aiding the pro-capitalist factions in those two countries as they fought against their communist antagonists. We can say that he is successful in Berlin, going toe-to-toe with Joseph Stalin by using the Berlin airlift and protecting West Berlin from being absorbed into Soviet East Germany. And then in China, we could say that Truman ultimately failed. I mean, how many balls are in the air for Truman here in a very short period of time? Quite a bit. So you could be an apologist for Truman and say, hey, what are you going to do short of sending in U.S. forces into China or using atomic weapons on China, and what is the parade of horribles that might actually transpire if those are the decisions that are made. Anyways, let's move on to another country in Asia that is going to be part and parcel to this larger Cold War during the Truman administration. Just as we saw in Greece, just as we saw in Turkey, just as we just discussed in China, there is going to be a power vacuum that occurs once World War II comes to a conclusion. There are going to be two rival factions attempting to administer the government of Korea now that Japan is gone. And one of the factions is pro-capitalism and the other is pro-communism. And civil war breaks out in Korea. And at this particular point in time, the United Nations has been formed and begins to implement its mission statement, which is to maintain or restore the peace, to bring about an end to the civil war in Korea. And the UN decides that the best way to get the two factions to lay down their weapons quickly would be to establish a truce line along the 38th parallel. North of the 38th parallel, the communists will be in power. South of the 30th parallel, the pro-Western capitalists will be in power. And it's agreed that there will be an election held. And that election throughout all of Korea, in a democratic fashion, will determine whether the leaders of a unified Korea will favor capitalism or communism. In short, the way of the election will determine whether Korea becomes communistic or capitalistic. Now, the elections are delayed, the elections are delayed, the elections are delayed in no small measure because of recognition on the part of the United States, England, and France that the communists would probably win and Korea would be reunified as a communist country, and the Truman Doctrine would come up flat there as well. Because the elections were delayed, the North Korean communists decided to take matters into their own hands. They crossed the 38th parallel, invaded South Korea, and pushed the South Korean forces all the way down to the southeastern tip of the South Korean peninsula. And it was a rout. The communists were carving through South Korea like a knife through warm butter, I guess. And it looked as if Korea might be reunified as a communist country through military force. Now the UN, charged with restoring the peace, of course mobilizes. The United States wields a great deal of influence in the UN, particularly at this juncture, because the Soviet Union had withdrew from the UN in protest over the United States, England, and France blocking Mao Zedong's Communist China from delivering up a representative to the UN. So the UN becomes, in large part, a tool of the United States at this point, and the United States is going to influence the UN to deploy its forces to South Korea to push the North Koreans back across the 30th parallel. Now there are all sorts of jeeps and tanks and planes with big UNs painted on the side, but make no mistake about it, upwards of 90% of the men in uniform, upwards of 90% of the machinery that's used is coming directly from the United States. The United States is certainly leading the charge here. Now, the effort is going to be led by General Douglas MacArthur, the hero of World War II, who presided over U.S. efforts in the Pacific. And he is going to implement a strategy that proves completely effective. There's going to be a beachhead established on the southeastern portion of the South Korean peninsula. Manpower and equipment are going to kind of be built up there to push back, while an amphibious landing is going to occur on the western side of the Korean peninsula, just outside of Seoul, and there's going to be kind of a flank that's created where the UN, or the United States, and the South Koreans are going to be pushing up from south to north, and also pushing from west to east, and just drive the North Koreans back across the 38th parallel. It proves to be totally effective. Just as quickly as the North Koreans had pushed southward, the UN, the United States, and the South Koreans are able to push northward, and the North Koreans are pushed back across the 38th parallel. Now the question becomes, will the United Nations, the United States, and the South Koreans push across the 30th parallel into North Korea and attempt to reunify Korea as a pro-capitalist country? And Douglas MacArthur, who has never been shy, is pleading with President Truman, to give him the authority to go into North Korea and get the job done once and for all. As a matter of fact, MacArthur is even advocating the use of atomic weapons, which, much to Truman's credit, he dismisses as a viable option. But nevertheless, Truman gives MacArthur the go-ahead to cross the 30th parallel and move into North Korea. Now, Truman does provide one caveat. He tells General MacArthur to stay clear of the Yalu River. The Yalu River is the border between China and North Korea. He says, stay clear of the Yalu River, because if we get too close to the Yalu River, Mao Zedong is going to see this as a national security risk, deploy his million-man army across the Yalu River into North Korea, and this will be more than the United States or the United Nations can handle. Now MacArthur says, sure, boss, but he didn't anticipate how easy it would be carving up through North Korea, and he keeps winning battle after battle, pushing north, north, north. He dismisses presidential orders, which wasn't the first time that he had done that, by the way, and gets darn close to the Yalu River. It triggers Truman's big fear. The Chinese crossed the Yalu River into North Korea and pushed the United Nations, the United States, and the South Koreans back across the 38th parallel before a truce is called and the Korean conflict comes to an end. Now, this is the way that it stands today. We have a North Korea and a South Korea, a communistic North Korea, a capitalistic South Korea, two countries that continue to hate each other. George W. Bush identified Iraq, Iran, and North Korea as the axis of evil. We know that relations between the United States and North Korea are strained at best, but this is really the creation of the Cold War, and it's never been resolved all the way up to our current moment. And so what do we have in regards to Korea and the Truman Doctrine? Well, we can maybe say this is a victory or a draw. I don't know how you want to spin it. Truman was not able to keep communism out of North Korea, but he was able to keep communism out of South Korea. Perhaps this was a draw for Truman. I kind of shiver when I say draw, because we're looking at hundreds of thousands of people who lost their lives in this Korean conflict. Koreans, Chinese, American soldiers, other participating nations sent some troops over as well. I mean, this was a very brutal and devastating conflict. But nevertheless, in terms of tallying whether communism or capitalism is victorious, it's really kind of a split along the 38th parallel. So Truman was successful in Greece, Turkey, Berlin, was not successful in China, and maybe a draw in Korea. Now, whatever happened to Douglas MacArthur? Well, Douglas MacArthur, of course, had violated presidential orders. He got too close to the Yalu River. Truman had no choice but to fire General Douglas MacArthur, and it was a huge emotional issue in the United States because MacArthur was a hero by virtue of his service during World War II. MacArthur, many people believed, was right and Truman was wrong. Perhaps the United States should have crossed the Yalu River, tried to destroy communism in China, use atomic weapons if need be to pull this off, and really shape the trajectory of history around the entire planet when the United States had the best chance to do so. I do not take that position. I think the United States would have expended any sort of moral capital that it had built up during World War II if it dropped nuclear weapons willy-nilly throughout Korea and China. Dropping nuclear weapons on 3 Asian countries within the span of half a decade would have caused all sorts of strife that the United States may have never been able to repair from. But certainly the amount of people who would have died if that had been the course taken would have been into the millions, I'm sure. But nevertheless, many people did like the swagger and the aggressiveness of MacArthur, and Truman's poll numbers actually decreased considerably after he fired MacArthur. But as Commander-in-Chief, as President of the United States, he couldn't have some rogue general out there going it alone. So in many ways, I think it was the right decision to make. Not just because I believe Truman had the better overall vision for what U.S. foreign policy should be, but also because there is a pecking order in the chain in command of the military, and MacArthur was subservient to the Commander-in-Chief and the President Truman. So anyways, I have one more slide for you here. It is a Cold War timeline, and the reason why I put all of this together here is just to show you all of the issues that President Truman had to deal with over a very short period of time. From the Potsdam Conference in 1945 to Truman's decision to use 2 atomic weapons on Japan during the final stages of World War II, Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in 1946, Truman responding to the Iron Curtain speech and George Kennan's long telegram with the Truman Doctrine, calling for the containment of communism to where it already exists, and the establishment of the United States as the world's policeman. You could throw into the mix there Greece and Turkey degenerating into civil war, and Truman really invoking the Truman Doctrine there and making sure that the capitalist factions in those 2 countries proved to be victorious. We have Truman going toe-to-toe with Stalin over the Berlin blockade by using the Berlin airlift, and he's victorious there. Get the formation of the national security state, inclusive of 2 large military alliances, the United States belonging to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the Soviet Union belonging to the Warsaw Pact. We have the Soviet Union breaking the United States nuclear monopoly in 1949 when it tests its first atomic weapon. We have Mao being victorious over Chiang Kai-shek in China in 1949 as well, and also the Korean conflict breaking out in 1950. I mean, it's bang, 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 and this is not even a comprehensive list of all of the issues Truman had to face. And so for the good, the bad, or the ugly, Truman had a very contentious and difficult presidency, had so many difficult decisions to make. I'm hard-pressed to think of very many presidents who had more on their table during their administration than Truman. Certainly I think that Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln had a lot to deal with while they were presidents. But Truman, I think, would be close on that list as important presidents. So anyway, that's the Truman Doctrine as it plays out during the early stages of the Cold War. I hope I've been able to establish the importance of the Truman Doctrine and give you some examples of where the Truman Doctrine was put to the test. You have the textbook to fall back on as well as you draft your essay questions for that potential, draft your essays for that potential essay question on the Truman Doctrine. As always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me at tsmith@yccd.edu.